Okay, so this is the analysis of 1914 by Wilfred Owen. The poem features two stanzas. The first stanza creates a dark tone for the poem and represents the chaos in Europe during the early stages of war. It also represents the loss of hope many of its civilians experienced. For starters, 1914 was the year that marked the beginning of World War I, and German Kaiser Wilhelm II promised the Germans a quick victory, which becomes a source of irony later on in the poem. War broke, and now the winter of the world, with perishing great darkness, closes in. So in general, winter has a negative connotation, representing cold, death, darkness, unknown, and in the case of World War I, the loss of hope. The world references the scale on which World War I occurred, affecting millions of people and tons of countries globally. Perishing darkness also serves as a foreshadowing of the imminent death and violence World War I would bring to Europe, and eventually the United States later on. So, furthermore, the foul tornado centered at Berlin is overall the width of Europe world, rending the sails of progress. The war is represented by a tornado, which is symbolic of the manner in which World War I swept over Europe. Like a tornado, World War I started abruptly and unexpectedly and destroyed anything in its way, which caused more and more countries and people to get involved later on. Also, the tornado creates a contradiction because tornadoes are natural disasters, and World War I was a disaster that killed thousands of people, but their deaths were caused by other people. Berlin served as the centralized location of early violence and chaos, as Germany was majorly influential in the ignition of World War I. The width of Europe again refers to the scale of the war and how little of Europe remained unaffected by it. By writing that the war rent sails of progress, Wilfred Owen refers to the abruptness of World War I, as it halted the progress of not only major strides towards peace within Europe before the war, but also took over the lives of many innocent civilians immediately. Now, the second half of the first stanza represents loss of hope more so than the first half, but still possesses a somber and dark tone. Rent or furled are all art's ensigns, verse wails, now begin famines of thought and feeling, love's wine's thin. The rending and furling of art's ensigns represent how the significance of art and literature deteriorated as a result of the beginning of World War I, which is really what this portion of the poem emphasizes and focuses on. Verse wails, as in poetic verses or verses in a song, further refers to the unimportance and lessening value of poetry and literature in Europe. These famines of thought and feeling refer not only to the loss of appreciation for liberal arts and emotion, but also possibly references the long-term rise of totalitarianism and authoritarian practices as a result of World War I. Love's Wine's Thin creates an analogy comparing emotion to wine as it began to lack flavor and thin to an emotionless state. As becomes more apparent later on in the poem, autumn represents hope, which is displayed as rotting and deteriorating as the war continued for much longer than expected by anybody. Now, as a whole, the second stanza represents a transition into hope for a new era after World War I, as many people believe something like it wouldn't occur again. For after spring had bloomed in early Greece, and summer blazed her glory out with Rome, and autumn softly fell, a harvest home. Firstly, Greece and Rome represent humanism and the reemergence of liberal arts and the value of emotion in Europe after the famines in which they were absent. Secondly, Greece and Italy were countries that started off neutral during the beginning of the war but joined in later. This also represents the scale of war and how it affected different countries at different times, for example, Greece in spring and Rome in summer. Now here, autumn's symbolic prominence becomes a priority within the poem because it represents warmth and calm and a generating hope for an end to war. The falling of leaves can represent the violence and deaths experienced during war, but also represent a transition into a new era as a tree would rid itself of old leaves and make rooms for new ones, which becomes a very significant conclusion of the poem. A slow grand age and rich with all increase. This grand age represents a hopeful new generation and new era for Europe after the casualties experienced during World War I, and the slowness of this grand age refers to the length of war and how unexpected it was to continue as long as it did. But now, for us, wild winter and the need of sowings for new spring and blood for seed. Wild winter represents the presence of sadness and cold, even though hope is generating as a whole. The need of sowing for new spring represents the attempt to recreate pre-war peace and progress, and again references the theme of replacing old with new. Furthermore, as the concluding line to the poem, blood for seed represents firstly, literally the blood that was spilled on European soil, but representatively how this blood could sprout a new generation and new hope for a peaceful era from the seeds of World War I. Overall, the poem ends on a hopeful note, which is ironic because World War II changed Europe forever in a detrimental way and contributed to the rise of World War II, which would change Europe even further.